Berlin, 1939. The Reich is rising, the world is watching, and behind the iron uniforms and icy salutes, something strange is happening. Affairs, mistresses, secret lovers, in the very heart of history's most brutal regime. These weren't just monsters, they were heartbreakers, womanizers, social climbers, and sex-obsessed strategists. Tonight, we're not asking how evil seduced a nation. We're asking who seduced whom behind the scenes of fascism. Welcome to a side of the Third Reich they didn't teach in history class. This is 30 Nazis who slept with everyone. And no, it's even weirder than it sounds. Before we dive headfirst into this deeply uncomfortable rabbit hole of uniforms, egos, and tangled bedsheets, hit that subscribe button if dark history, unsolved mysteries, and morally messy stories are your thing. Drop a comment below and tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Berlin, 3 a.m. in Ohio? I want to know who else is wide awake for this madness. 1. Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was obsessed with control, over countries, over ideology, and, ironically, over intimacy. Despite projecting an image of celibacy for the fatherland, Hitler's private life was cluttered with secrecy, manipulation, and a suspiciously theatrical level of romantic drama. His long-term relationship with Eva Braun was less of a love story and more of a heavily curated myth, complete with censorship and surveillance. But Braun wasn't the first, nor the most disturbing. There was Gaily Raubal, his half-niece, whose relationship with him blurred more than just moral lines. Then came Unity Mitford, the British aristocrat who stalked him into his affections. Rumors swirled. Some said he was celibate, others claimed he was a voyeur, and a few speculated he had a dark fetish for emotional dependency. Whatever the truth, it wasn't romantic. It was tactical. Women weren't companions in Hitler's world. They were props. And when your most famous love story ends in a bunker pact, it's only fair to ask, who was playing who? Because the next man didn't fake fidelity. He flaunted excess. 2. Hermann Göring. Hermann Göring didn't just indulge, he devoured. Art, jewelry, hunting trophies, morphine, stolen mansions, entire economies, and lovers, lots of them. If Hitler was tight-lipped about intimacy, Göring was its walking billboard. Married twice, sure, but committed? Only to self-adornment. His first wife was a noblewoman with a tragic end. His second was a Swedish actress handpicked to match his theatrical flair. Between the marriages were mistresses, affairs, and countless indulgences, often whispered about among party elites with the same awe reserved for his ridiculous uniforms. Göring's bedroom politics weren't separate from his public image. They were part of the costume. Every affair was another notch on a gold-plated cane, another opera set piece in the great production of Göring, the grotesque peacock of the Reich. He loved decadence because it made him feel untouchable. Which is fitting because the man next in line also chased actresses, but with a little more poetry and a lot more propaganda. 2 down, 28 to go. And we've barely scratched the surface of ego, ambition, and romantic disaster. If you're still here, clearly you've got the stomach for it. So go ahead and subscribe. This channel's made for you. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it? Are you doom-scrolling in London at 2 a.m.? Watching this over coffee in Manila? I want to know who else is keeping history weird with me tonight. 3. Joseph Goebbels. If Göring collected lovers like jewels, Joseph Goebbels curated them like scripts. The Third Reich's master propagandist was also its most hopeless romantic. If your idea of romance includes obsessive diary entries, declarations of eternal passion, and a trail of heartbroken actresses. His most infamous affair was with Lida Barova, a Czech film star whose mere existence nearly ended his marriage and infuriated Hitler himself. Goebbels wrote about her with the intensity of a teenage poet and the self-pity of a dictator denied his favorite toy. But Barova was only one of many. His diaries read less like political records and more like a serialized melodrama, complete with betrayals, sobbing confessions, and dramatic reconciliations. Behind the speeches and slogans, Goebbels was ruled by craving, both for power and for the kind of emotional validation that no regime could ever legislate into existence. And if Goebbels was driven by longing, the man who followed him believed love should be catalogued with military precision. 4. Heinrich Himmler. Heinrich Himmler believed in sacred bloodlines, Aryan purity, and, curiously, having a backup family. Behind his rimless spectacles and bureaucratic demeanor was a man who treated love like a eugenics experiment. His official marriage produced a daughter. His unofficial mistress, Hedwig Potthast, gave him 2 more children and a shadow household hidden behind Reich decorum. Himmler wasn't passionate, he was clinical. His letters to Potthast weren't exactly dripping with seduction, they read like memos. He catalogued his affections like he catalogued prisoners, orderly, secret, and with disturbing precision. And while others in the Nazi elite fell into scandal, Himmler's dual life was weirdly normalized inside the SS. Why? Because the Reich's high priests could do what they wanted, as long as it served the myth. Himmler preached abstinence and practiced duplicity. He sold purity while writing bedtime stories to both his wives, but for all his control, the next man on this list wielded chaos like a love potion and left scorched earth wherever he flirted. 5. Reinhard Heydrich. Reinhard Heydrich was charming in the way that cobras are graceful, lethal, elegant, and always a few seconds from violence. Before he became the Butcher of Prague, Heydrich was a naval officer kicked out for a breach of promise, essentially for cheating and lying about it. That was just the warm-up act. In occupied territories, Heydrich's affairs weren't whispered secrets. They were open rumors, often involving Czech women, often leveraged with power. He played violin at elite dinners, seduced with mechanical precision, then vanished into administrative brutality. Women were another front in his psychological warfare, a test of dominance in social form. SS officers admired him. Others feared what came with loving him, attachments that ended coldly, politically, or both. There were no grand love letters, only patterns. He seduced, discarded, then reorganized the furniture. But while Heydrich weaponized charm, the man stepping in next tried to bottle diplomacy as desire, slipping into bedrooms with the same ease he lied through treaties. 6. Joachim von Ribbentrop. Joachim von Ribbentrop fancied himself a man of the world. To others, he was just a wine salesman with a knack for name-dropping. But before he was forging pacts and shaking hands with Mussolini, he was maneuvering through Berlin's high society, building a reputation as both a diplomatic manipulator and an incorrigible womanizer. It's easy to forget, amidst the photo ops and poorly negotiated alliances, that Ribbentrop used charm the way lesser men use passports. Fluent in French, fond of luxury, and always in the right parlor at the right time, his affairs were less about lust and more about leverage. His sexual life mirrored his foreign policy, ambitious, short-sighted, and usually ending in disaster. Behind closed doors, he was less Casanova and more opportunist, chasing aristocrats, actresses, and diplomats' wives with the same desperation he used to court Hitler's favor. But for all his seductive networking, Ribbentrop never understood consequence, a failing the next man would personify in a courtroom and in bed. 7. Hans Frank. Hans Frank thought he was a philosopher king, a lawyer with a poetic soul and a penchant for quoting Goethe between war crimes. In reality, he was the Governor-General of occupied Poland and a walking contradiction. Publicly pious, privately gluttonous, he kept a string of affairs across Krakow and Warsaw, charming mistresses with cultured monologues and looted champagne. His marriage endured mostly because his wife adapted to the art of selective blindness. Frank's diaries, dense with narcissism, hinted at guilt, but swerved into self-pity faster than his drivers could clear roadblocks. His lovers came and went like his legal convictions, fluid, temporary, and always self-justified. He believed in moral order but lived in hypocrisy, keeping both crucifixes and mistresses close at hand. As the war drew on, his appetite didn't wane, it just diversified. But while Frank intellectualized his sins, the next man on the list needed no excuses. He simply built things, charmed everyone, and hid his affairs behind a perfectly engineered smile. 8. Albert Speer. Albert Speer was the Reich's golden boy, a self-proclaimed apolitical architect with suspiciously good timing and even better excuses. Hitler's favorite designer, Speer, turned rubble into spectacle, and his personal life mirrored his professional one, orderly on the outside, quietly chaotic within. Behind his respectable marriage stood Berlin's salon circuit, where Speer moved with ease, striking up affairs with actresses, artists, and intellectuals who admired his talent, if not his ethics. He wasn't flamboyant like Göring, nor obsessive like Goebbels. He was subtle, charming, intelligent, always in control. That's what made him dangerous. His affairs weren't messy scandals. They were whispered secrets, just out of reach. Speer didn't seduce with fire, he seduced with calm, an architect of both monuments and illusions. And when the smoke cleared, he walked away cleaner than most, even if his conscience wasn't. But where Speer floated through Berlin soirees, the next man danced right into them, stage lights blazing, youth in tow, and a slogan always on his lips. 9. Baldur von Schirach. Baldur von Schirach was the Reich's youth whisperer, a poet turned propagandist who styled himself as a cultural revolutionary with a soft spot for Wagner and wide-eyed idealism. But behind the recitations and grand speeches was a man entirely too comfortable in the company of actresses, socialites, and adoring young fans. As Hitler youth leader, Schirach was the party's poster boy for national purity and moral discipline. In private, he played a very different tune. He was a regular at theater galas, Berlin parties, and private salons, where his interest in youth blurred into something less ideological and more opportunistic. His marriage to Heinrich Hoffmann's daughter gave him elite access, but monogamy was not part of the arrangement. His lovers often came from the world of arts, young, ambitious, easily dazzled by proximity to power. Schirach wanted to be both revolutionary and romantic, but lacked the discipline for either. And if Schirach chased youth, the next man took the opposite path, seeking control, not affection, from his inner circle. 10. Ernst Röhm. Ernst Röhm didn't pretend to be anything he wasn't, at least not in private. As the head of the SA, Röhm wielded paramilitary power with the swagger of a man who knew he was untouchable until he wasn't. Openly homosexual in a regime that preached moral purity, Röhm's personal life wasn't just tolerated, it was ignored so long as he stayed useful. His lovers were often young SA recruits, folded into his private circle and his public image like accessories. Röhm didn't see contradiction, he saw entitlement. His loyalty to Hitler was personal, emotional, even obsessive, though not always reciprocated. His relationships blurred lines between affection, dominance, and mentorship, all under the banner of revolutionary camaraderie. The regime eventually turned on him not for his sexuality, but for his independence. Röhm's downfall wasn't desire, it was audacity. And while he made no effort to hide his personal life, the next man wore his indiscretions like whispers, buried beneath party rhetoric and cautious charm. 11. Gregor Strasser. Gregor Strasser was the Nazi Party's nearly man, the rival who could have been more, had history bent just slightly in his favor. While Hitler built myth, Strasser built networks, and in those circles he earned a reputation not just for political savvy, but for romantic flexibility. Married? Yes. Faithful? No. Strasser's affairs weren't tabloid scandals. They were quiet, frequent, and politically dangerous. He was known to be magnetic, more socially adept than Hitler, more grounded than Goebbels, and more openly ambitious than most dared to be. His relationships, often with women in the movement or sympathetic journalists, were equal parts strategic and indulgent. He made women feel seen, then moved on without ceremony. It wasn't cruelty, it was momentum. Strasser believed in ideas, and people were just part of the machinery. But unlike the men who survived by repression, Strasser was too visible, too vocal, too real. And realness didn't survive in the Reich, especially not when the next man's version of intimacy came with a paper trail and a very public descent into mania. 12. Julius Streicher. If the Nazi regime had a shame drawer, Julius Streicher would be in it, stuffed at the back, covered in dust, and too embarrassing to display. As the founder of Der Stürmer, Streicher was the regime's cartoon villain, a man whose obsession with degradation wasn't limited to the page. His private life mirrored the filth he published, full of whispered affairs, coercive encounters, and a compulsive need for control. He was removed from power not for ideology, but for being a liability, morally, politically, and socially. Yet even after his fall from official grace, Streicher kept orbiting the regime's edges, holding court in his mansion, taking lovers under the guise of devotion, and insisting that his truths were misunderstood art. His behavior made even other Nazis cringe, which is saying something. Where Röhm was open and Strasser strategic, Streicher was grotesque, both in print and in practice. But the next man took a different approach. Quiet, clever, and dangerous in the way only a sycophant with secrets could be. 13. Karl Hanke. Karl Hanke was the kind of man who treated ambition like foreplay. He climbed the Nazi ranks with ruthless charm, combining SS brutality with a playboy's hunger for attention and affection. Goebbels, who rarely missed a scandal, repeatedly documented Hanke's affairs in his diary, often with equal parts envy and disapproval. Hanke didn't hide his indiscretions, he paraded them. Actresses, secretaries, party functionaries, they all drifted in and out of his circle, like temporary props in the theater of his self-importance. His final appointment as Gauleiter of Breslau turned the city into his personal stage set, where both propaganda and flirtation flowed freely. He had an appetite for beauty, but no loyalty to anything but power. And as the war turned bleak, Hanke doubled down on cruelty, on charm, and on the fantasy that he still mattered. But where Hanke seduced through arrogance, the next man ruled through bureaucracy, his affairs carefully compartmentalized like everything else in his increasingly paranoid universe. 14. Martin Bormann. Martin Bormann wasn't seductive in the traditional sense. He was invisible. That was his strength and his strategy. As Hitler's private secretary, Bormann made sure everything passed through him: orders, memos, secrets, and sometimes mistresses. He was married, yes, but also kept a long-term mistress, actress Manja Behrens, with whom he had at least 2 children. And those were just the documented affairs. Bormann understood intimacy the way he understood politics, as transactions to be managed, concealed, and leveraged. He wasn't flamboyant, he was efficient. Coldly devoted to Hitler, he built a shadow empire of influence, favor trading, and carefully curated relationships. His lovers were often kept away from public view, like everything else in his personal vault of control. Power for Bormann wasn't sexy, it was surgical. But even a man who orchestrated relationships like logistics couldn't hide from consequence forever, especially not when the next name on the list made his affairs not just frequent, but practically a naval tradition. 15. Wilhelm Canaris. Wilhelm Canaris was the spy master who never quite picked a side. As head of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence, he played a game of subtle sabotage while pretending loyalty, both to the Reich and, apparently, to his wife. But the historical record shows a very different portrait behind the naval medals. One of frequent affairs, often during his deployments, and always cloaked in discretion. Canaris wasn't a flamboyant seducer. He was quiet, calculating, and strangely alluring. Women were drawn to his enigmatic presence, to his gentle manner that contrasted so starkly with the brutal system he served, and sometimes resisted. His affairs often went unnoticed, much like his coded efforts to undermine the SS from within. For Canaris, love wasn't revolutionary. It was another form of espionage. Trust was currency, distance was safety, and passion was always better when kept at arm's length. But where Canaris walked the line between betrayal and belief, the next man bulldozed it, with speed, flair, and engineering precision. 16. Fritz Todt. Fritz Todt didn't have time for romance, or so he claimed. The man behind the Reich's autobahns and bunkers cultivated an image of tireless work and national duty, always too busy building to bother with scandal. But the reality was different. As one of Hitler's closest technocrats, Todt moved through the elite with a quiet charisma that rarely made headlines but often left a trail. He had affairs, discreet but well-placed, often with women connected to the party's upper echelons or cultural elite. He wasn't a showman, he was a problem solver. And for some, that competence alone was intoxicating. Todt balanced his personal life with the same meticulous calculation he brought to concrete and steel. There were no public meltdowns, no grand romantic gestures, just quiet arrangements, whispered understandings, and the occasional weekend retreat disguised as official travel. Todt built roads to nowhere, fortresses to crumble, and relationships to be erased from the record. But while he built empires, the next man destroyed stages and seduced his way straight through the spotlight. 17. Sepp Dietrich. Sepp Dietrich wasn't a strategist. He was a fighter, a performer, and, to his admirers, a myth. As one of the Waffen-SS's most celebrated commanders, Dietrich's war resume overshadowed his nightlife resume. Barely. Behind the grizzled battlefield exterior was a man who thrived in the presence of stardom, particularly when it came dressed in heels and stage makeup. Dietrich had a taste for actresses, dancers, entertainers, women who admired uniforms and medals, and men who knew how to wear them. His charm was blunt, charismatic, sometimes crude, but effective. There were rumors, always, of escapades during leave, of theater backrooms and parties that blurred into dawn. Unlike the colder bureaucrats around him, Dietrich made no attempt to sanitize his reputation. He was loyal to Hitler, but not to monogamy. And if battlefield glory faded, his romantic mythos only grew louder in whispered circles. But Dietrich's magnetism wasn't unique. The next man shared it, amplified it, and added something even more dangerous: ambition wrapped in aristocratic polish. 18. Karl Wolff. Karl Wolff looked like the SS had stepped off a movie set and ordered champagne. Suave, silver-tongued, and impeccably dressed, Wolff was less a soldier and more a PR fantasy, one that happened to be real. As Himmler's chief of personal staff, he moved with practiced ease through elite gatherings and private salons, where affairs weren't just common, they were expected. Wolff's lovers included actresses and high society fixtures, women drawn to power, charm, or the illusion of both. He knew the role: the charming officer, the smooth guest, the attentive partner, until it was time to disappear. Wolff balanced military loyalty with social agility, never quite as cold as Bormann, never quite as reckless as Goebbels. His affairs left little public drama, but much speculation, and beneath the charm lay something colder: a man who navigated war crimes and flings with equal nonchalance. Wolff played both the lover and the lieutenant with flair, but the next man? He wasn't playing at all. He took pleasure in power and never pretended otherwise. 19. Ernst Kaltenbrunner. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was not a man people forgot. Towering, scar-faced, and perpetually looming, he cut a figure straight out of a villain's storyboard and leaned into it. As head of the RSHA, he was responsible for some of the regime's most brutal policies. But behind his bureaucratic coldness was an unrestrained appetite for domination, both institutional and personal. His affairs were numerous and documented, often with women drawn to status, fear, or the sheer gravitational pull of power. Kaltenbrunner didn't seduce so much as absorb, pulling lovers into a dark orbit where charm was replaced with control and affection with performance. He kept mistresses throughout the war, sometimes shielding them with favors, other times discarding them as liabilities. Unlike other Nazis who balanced image with indulgence, Kaltenbrunner saw no need for balance. His authority justified everything, including pleasure. He craved intensity, not intimacy. But for all his severity, the next man was his opposite, a flamboyant rogue who turned danger into celebrity and seduction into an international pastime. 20. Otto Skorzeny. Otto Skorzeny was the kind of man Pulp Fiction couldn't invent fast enough. Tall, scar-faced, and soaked in bravado, he was Hitler's favorite commando and Nazi Germany's accidental action hero. Best known for his daring rescue of Mussolini, Skorzeny quickly discovered that nothing seduces quite like notoriety. His lovers weren't just flings, they were part of the legend. He charmed actresses in Berlin, aristocrats in Rome, and later socialites in Madrid and Buenos Aires, where his post-war life became an international tour of whispers, winks, and well-dressed disappearances. Skorzeny made promiscuity look like espionage, always half suggesting more than he revealed. He wasn't loyal. He was cinematic. His affairs moved as fluidly as his allegiances, and few women ever knew where they stood. But then again, neither did his enemies. He lived like a man who believed war was just another stage, and passion just another op. Yet beneath the swagger was an artist of perception, something the next man embodied fully, though his medium was stone, not sabotage. 21. Arno Breker. Arno Breker didn't fire weapons. He sculpted gods. Hitler's official artist and the Reich's self-anointed Michelangelo, Breker created towering forms of muscular perfection, all frozen in eternal conquest. But his private life was anything but static. A known favorite in Hitler's inner circle, Breker moved easily through Germany's cultural elite, collecting admirers with a chiseled jaw and carefully curated detachment. Women, especially in artistic and aristocratic circles, were drawn to him not just for his skill, but for the aura of myth he carried. Affairs were plentiful, quiet, and often conducted with the same aesthetic discipline he applied to marble. Breker didn't chase. He allowed himself to be sought, admired, consumed like one of his statues, impressive, remote, and perfectly lit. While others in the regime burned through lovers like propaganda leaflets, Breker preferred a slower seduction, a gallery opening here, a whispered conversation there, and always the glint of higher ideals. But art fades, and empires fall. The next man, he brought no ideals, only indulgence, taken by force or favor. 22. Albert Forster. Albert Forster ruled like a man trying to impress no one but himself. As Gauleiter of Danzig, West Prussia, he fused administration with hedonism, turning occupied territory into a playground for both power and pleasure. His reputation for excess wasn't whispered, it was expected. Forster kept Polish mistresses during his tenure, breaking both moral codes and racial laws he publicly enforced. But rules were for other people. He moved through affairs like he moved through policies, quickly, impulsively, and without a trace of self-doubt. His charm wasn't refined. It was brash, entitled, the kind that clung to men who confused power with desirability. Even his own party colleagues rolled their eyes at his appetite, but no one could quite stop him. Forster wasn't strategic. He was instinctual, driven by whatever urge came next. He called it confidence. Others called it carelessness. And while he played colonial king in the East, the man who followed him would go even further. blending authority with appetite in a way that made even party loyalists uncomfortable. 23. Erich Koch. Erich Koch didn't just administer territories, he consumed them. As Reichskommissar of Ukraine, Koch ran his fiefdom like a feudal lord with a taste for spectacle, cruelty, and constant companionship. His reputation for brutality was matched only by his reputation for indulgence. Multiple mistresses followed him from East Prussia to Kyiv, and it was said that few women in his circle remained untouched by his attention. Where others cloaked their affairs in discretion, Koch operated like shame had been rationed out of his character. He surrounded himself with luxury, fine clothing, banquets, art, and women. Lots of them. His desires were immediate, impulsive, and insulated by fear. In his mind, authority granted access, and access meant entitlement. Koch wasn't loved, but he wasn't ignored either. His relationships weren't romantic. They were transactional, built on presence, proximity, and power imbalance. But for all his brutishness, the man stepping in next offered a more refined poison. Military medals, polite manners, and a long trail of hearts left behind. 24. Hans Günther von Kluge. Hans Günther von Kluge was many things. Aristocrat, field marshal, strategist, but never a stranger to romance. Among the Wehrmacht elite, von Kluge stood out for his intellect, charisma, and a reputation for quiet, frequent affairs that seemed to follow him from one front to the next. He carried himself with old-world charm, a relic of Prussian nobility repurposed for modern war, and women were drawn to the contradiction, a calculating general with poetic instincts and restless eyes. His liaisons were rarely scandalous. They were subtle, woven into diplomatic dinners, quiet evenings in occupied cities, and the spaces between battles. Von Kluge was not reckless. He was magnetic. Affairs with secretaries, nurses, and occasional civilian confidants were whispered about but rarely confirmed, just the way he preferred it. His loyalty to the Reich wavered, but his devotion to discretion never did. And while Kluge walked the razor's edge between command and collapse, the next man charged in without hesitation, smiling, sweating, and seducing his way through continents. 25. Walther Rauff. Walther Rauff was an opportunist in every sense, mobile, adaptable, and always one step ahead of consequences. As an SS officer deeply involved in the Reich's most chilling logistics, Rauff somehow still found time for a personal life that seemed almost too cinematic to be real. After the war, he vanished into the maze of South America's exile circuits, but wherever he surfaced, North Africa, Chile, Ecuador, so did stories of his women. Mistresses, lovers, short-term flings. Rauff didn't settle. He rotated. He presented himself as cultured, fluent, mysterious. That combination went a long way in post-war cities where truth was negotiable and pasts could be rewritten over dinner. Even in hiding, he managed to live as if charisma erased culpability. For Rauff, each affair was another reinvention, another alias. Love didn't ground him, it camouflaged him. And yet, where Rauff seduced from the shadows, the man who followed him never hid at all. He was born in the chaos and lived on stage, equal parts gangster, showman, and party loyalist. 26. Christian Weber. Christian Weber was a thug in a tailored coat. An early member of the Nazi Party, former bouncer, and longtime Munich enforcer, Weber clawed his way into power through brute loyalty and nightlife instincts. He wasn't a statesman, he was a spectacle. And so were his affairs. Known for hosting extravagant parties and surrounding himself with actresses, cabaret girls, and socialites, Weber was the regime's unofficial master of ceremonies. Women came and went through his world like smoke through stage lights, enticed by protection, money, or just proximity to danger. He played the role of benefactor and gatekeeper, a man who could open doors or ruin reputations, depending on the hour and the mood. His romances were messy, transactional, and often public. Weber didn't do subtle. His lovers were part of the performance, cast members in his living opera of vice and favors. But for all his excess, the next man was quieter, more educated, more composed, and no less tangled in secrets. 27. Otto Dietrich. Otto Dietrich was Hitler's press chief, but he carried himself more like a silver screen agent than a Nazi mouthpiece. Polished, articulate, and always impeccably dressed, Dietrich's job was to control the Reich's image. His own, however, slipped easily behind closed doors. A married man with more than a few side arrangements, Dietrich moved through Berlin's intellectual and entertainment circles with an ease that few in the party could manage without scandal. He had affairs with actresses, journalists, and sometimes women from the very media he sought to silence. His seductions were subtle: long conversations, shared ideals, cultivated charm. Unlike Weber, Dietrich didn't flaunt his conquests. He documented everything else but left this part of his life out of the footnotes. It was his only act of discretion. But where Dietrich traded in nuance, the man coming next believed secrets were best hidden in plain sight, especially when your mistress had her own room in Reich headquarters. 28. Hans Lammers. Hans Lammers was the type of man who understood paperwork more than passion, but that didn't stop him from quietly indulging in both. As chief of the Reich Chancellery, he had the final say on who got an audience with Hitler, making him one of the most powerful gatekeepers in Nazi Germany. Behind his stoic exterior and bureaucratic precision was a long-standing affair with a mistress reportedly housed conveniently close to his office. Colleagues described him as cold and exacting, but women in his private life painted a different picture: measured affection, quiet gifts, and the kind of loyalty that looked more like contractual obligation than romance. Lammers wasn't flashy, he was consistent. The affair lasted for years, shielded by layers of official privilege and the dullness of his public persona. His was a love life kept out of the spotlight, deliberately so. But where Lammers kept his desires buried under paper and protocol, the man arriving next didn't bury anything. He marched into rooms with the confidence of a god and the impulses of a demolition charge. 29. Theodor Eicke. Theodor Eicke believed in discipline. He wrote it into his uniforms, screamed it into his subordinates, and carved it into the bones of the institutions he helped build. But behind the rigid posture and barking voice was a man fueled by excess. As the architect of the early concentration camp system and commander of the SS division Totenkopf, Eicke's brutality was matched only by his appetite for control and women. He kept mistresses across Germany, often transferring them between cities with the same strategic thinking he applied to logistics. His lovers were sometimes SS auxiliaries, sometimes secretaries, and always temporary. There was no illusion of romance, only access, attention, and eventual replacement. Unlike others who cloaked their affairs in charm or ideology, Eicke made no attempt at subtlety. His desires were as transactional as his command style. He took what he wanted and discarded what he didn't. But while Eicke built loyalty through fear, the final man in our descent preferred a more naval approach, smooth, reserved, and quietly treacherous. 30. Karl Dönitz. Karl Dönitz styled himself as a principled naval officer, a man of duty, order, and oceanic metaphors. His speeches invoked sacrifice, not seduction. His image was all clean uniforms and steely resolve. But beneath the surface of the Kriegsmarine's commander lurked a surprisingly complex and discreet private life. While publicly conservative and outwardly faithful, post-war biographies and interrogations uncovered a different reality. Dönitz had a string of discreet affairs during his naval career, especially during the early years when charm, uniform, and proximity to power worked like a tide. He preferred civilian admirers to party women, and his relationships were quiet enough to avoid official notice, but visible enough to reach the pages of later historical footnotes. His affairs were not flamboyant, but they were strategic, kept far from scandal, yet close enough to hint at the duplicity he would later bring to his brief stint as Hitler's appointed successor. And so, even at the final stop in this parade of paradoxes, the pattern holds. When power meets desire, truth rarely survives the paperwork.